Hi, and welcome to another Type with Me. In today's video, I want to talk about content projection in Angular. It's a nice topic because you can do a lot when you're designing your components, right? So content projection is a pattern in which you insert or project the content you want to use inside another component. For example, you could have a card component that accepts content provided by that other component. You have three different types. You have a single slot, a multi-slot, and a conditional content projection. With the single slot, a component accepts content from a single source, and with multiple slots, a component accepts content from multiple sources. A single slot doesn't have to name the slot. With multiple slots, one slot can have no name, it can exist without a name, and the other slots can have their names, right? So you can do that by just adding the select attribute on the slot. Within Angular, it's ng content, and of course, I'm going to show that how this looks like within our application. So first of all, the single slot content projection. You have here an ng content, just one single slot, right? The ng content. And so if you go to the app component, you see here that we have an app single slot, and here you have project content for that single slot, right? And that will be projected within our ng content right here. That's the first one. If you now go to multi-slot, here you see that we have our multi-slot content projection. We have our default, which has no name. Like I said before, you could have a content projection of a multi-slot which has no name. And then you have here our question. It has ng content, and then we select our heading, right? So we can do it like this. If we now go to our app components, you see here that our app multi-slot can have our p. And then here we have our heading that we define there, and then we can have content projection in Angular. We can have also an ng container, and then we can say ng project as, and then we can add it to our heading, right? And then we have here is content projection cool. And then we have the rest of the content that we have, and that will be in the multi-slot component within ng content, right? So we have our single slot, and now I explained a little bit how we have our multi-slot. Of course, you could have other slots as well. You can just copy paste this. You can add other ones as well. Here, for example, name it extra, something that you very easily could do within your multi-slot component. But imagine that we have now our multi-slot specific. We have a component that we only want to allow to add into a content projection. So in this case, we have our multi-slot specific, here our multi-slot specific component, and we want to have our ng content. We want to select our app my allowed component. I have here my allowed component right here. It has my allowed component works, and then a name. You will see here that I have an input, put it on there as well. If we go now to our app components.html, then you will see that we have here our app my allowed component, which has a name first, and then we have something that has a name second, and we have also our app my disallowed component in there, and then we will see how this looks like when we render this out within our application, right? Now, if we go to our application, you see here that we have our first one, single slot. It just has the projected content for single slots, right? Everything that's just been as a child component will be projected in there. Then we have our multi-slot content projection, where we have our default. that's the one that has no name, right? And then we have the question which has the heading stamp on it with content projection Angular and is content projection cool. Then we have here our two components, the my allowed component works first and second, and then we have our default. And you need to know that if you have components, if you have content that is not the components that you want to have in the my allowed components section, then it will put it into the default that has no name. So in the my disallowed component works, well, if you don't want that component to be rendered out, well, then you also need to remove the default one, right? All right, so now we have here our my slot specific. If I just delete this one and go only for this one, then you will see that it will just work, right? And now you see that only my allowed component works. It's important that you know that this is the way multi-slot behaves, because it can be something that you say like, hey, my disallowed component is there and I don't want to be there. So it's important that you just understand why it's there. If you just have an ng content which has no name, well, then it could be that it just puts it there, right? So if you just, for example, use ng content select and then heading, for example, then you will see that it will have no content, also not the disallowed content. So let me show you how this looks like. So right here we are, and then we see here heading and question, and then my allowed component works, right? So another thing that I can just show you is that we have, for example, a button here with display, and then you just have an ngIf for display, and then you can just show your content projection or just don't show it, right? So that's also possible, and that's a little bit the conditional one that's important to tell you about. You can do that also with ng template. If you go to the website of Angular and you look into project content projection, then you will see that it has a section around conditional ones as well. So I'm just going to show this to you. It's the very basic one to show you that it's possible to also show or hide specific content projections, right? Here I have my display input on the app multi-slot specific. So now I can very easily toggle it. And you see here my allowed component works. If I toggle it, it just disappears. So you can very easily have also some conditional content in there as well. You can do very fancy and cool stuff in there. For example, one of the things that I do or find very easy to do is you detect if you are mobile or not, and then you just project your content differently when you're on mobile than you're on desktop. These are things that I think are very, very valuable to do and to think about when you're setting up your application within Angular. So for example, the conditional content projection, you get a little bit more explanation if you want to in this section. If your component needs to conditionally render content or render content multiple times, you should configure that component to accept an ng template element that contains the content you want to conditionally render. So again, I think if you really want to go a little bit deeper into it, there are a lot of possibilities to do so, not only within the ngIf that I showed you, but also within other things that you could do. For example, it's important that you could, for example, use the content child or content children decorators. If we go a little bit deeper into it, and you see here that it's a property decorator that configures a content query, and so you can go and grab all these children's of your parent component and then do stuff with it. I think it's also something very cool. I just don't go into much detail of this because it will drive us a little bit too far. Maybe in the near future I will create a video about it to just explain. If you think it's useful to create a video about it, please tell in the comments below that you want something for that, for the content child or content children decorator, and I will see if I can create some kind of nice content for you to show you how that works. So I hope that this explains a lot. One of the things that I still going to tell you is a small wrap, right? So we saw a single slot, we saw a multi-slot, with a specific component that needs to be rendered in that multi-slot, right? You can have multiple selectors. You could do a selection for components, but I think you can do it as well for other things. So just dive a little bit into it. Each slot can specify a CSS selector that determines which content goes into that slot. This pattern is referred to as multi-slot content projection. With this pattern, you must specify where you want the projected content to appear. You accomplish this task by using the select attribute of ng content. And then of course you can use the conditional one as well. If you don't want to show these slots, you don't need to. One of the examples that I already told you about is the mobile versus desktop. I think it's a very powerful one that you definitely need to look into, and then you can, for example, say, hey, if it's desktop, do that. If it's mobile, do that, or maybe have 3 different stages, like, hey, if it's mobile, do that, if it's tablet, do that, if it's desktop, do that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you learned something from it, and subscribe to my channel if you want to have more videos around web development, TypeScript, Angular, and so on. Thank you very much. See you next time.